On November 30th, 500,000 Soviet soldiers invaded Finland. Despite the significant advantage in troops and equipment, the Red Army suffered immense losses. In just 3 months of war, around 330,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. In this video, we will look at the Soviet-Finnish War and also learn why Finland was cutting military expenses and whether the Soviet Union planned to capture the entire country. By the end of 1939, as Europe stood in eager anticipation of new developments after the fall of Poland, a war began between the Soviet Union and Finland. However, it was only diplomatic at first. Throughout 1939, intense negotiations between the two countries took place regarding the status of the Karelian Isthmus and small islands in the Gulf of Finland. Since 1809, Finland has been part of the Russian Empire as the Grand Duchy of Finland. However, the February and then October revolutions raised serious questions about its sovereignty. In 1917, Finland declared its independence. Having endured its civil war and conducting several raids in Soviet territory, in 1920, a peace treaty was signed between the Soviet government and Finland. However, reconciliation with the Soviet Union did not satisfy radical groups within the population, who dreamed of creating Greater Finland, incorporating parts of Karelia, Estonia, Norway, and possibly Sweden. Therefore, despite the signed documents, they continued to operate in the territory of Soviet Karelia, even sparking an uprising there. But as time passed, it became more and more evident that this idea of expansion was not embraced by the people. Although it did find an audience among the leftists, it was not officially accepted. On the contrary, in the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s, the government pursued an extremely pacifist policy, cutting funding for the armed forces. Due to budget constraints from 1927 up until the mid-1930s, military exercises were not conducted, and the weaponry still consisted of tanks and vehicles from World War I. The system of defensive fortifications on the border with the Soviet Union, named the Mannerheim Line, was not spared from this pacifist trend. Its construction was halted in 1924, and until 1932, it was in an extremely dilapidated state. The reluctance to spend huge sums on what was likely unnecessary was to blame. What use is it to allocate such large sums to the military department if war is not foreseen? This is a quote from the head of the Finnish bank and later president of Finland, Risto Ryti, in response to Mannerheim's demand for funding for construction. In light of future events and the reduction in army funding, it appears at least illogical. But all this was because many truly believed that no one would start a new war after World War I. The Soviet Union had already been recognized and was in the League of Nations. And in Europe, there was some semblance of peace. Such a course of events followed almost until the end of the 30s, when the threat of war became obvious, even to the most ardent skeptics. By that time, the Soviet Union publicly expressed concerns about Finland's neutrality. The reason was by no means that Stalin or anyone else in the Soviet leadership sincerely believed that Finland could threaten the Soviet Union or even Leningrad. It was not the Finnish army, but merely the geographical location that mattered. Since 1920, Finland's border was only 32 kilometers from the outskirts of Leningrad. And the Soviet government believed that Finland's neutrality was shaky. Remembering its ties with Germany during World War I and the assistance from Germans during the Finnish Civil War, the USSR could not be sure that the status quo would not be violated in the future, even if not depending on the Finnish government's stance, at least because they would not be able to withstand German intervention. By the way, in 1944, when rumors spread about Finland's withdrawal from the war, there were indeed plans in Germany to overthrow the government and install their puppets, so the Soviets' concerns were not entirely unfounded. Speculations and fears were followed by open negotiations, during which the Soviet Union demanded Finland to relinquish the Karelian Isthmus and dismantle the Mannerheim Line, as well as lease several small islands in the Gulf of Finland in exchange for an area twice the size and territory, precisely the area where the Finns helped spark an uprising in 1921. The Finns refused, but made a counter-offer to cede the Terajoki area to the Soviet Union. This would have doubled the distance between Leningrad and the Finnish border, though it was much less than what the Soviet Union demanded. But Stalin rejected the offer. Among other things, a significant factor influencing Finland's refusal was distrust towards the Soviet Union. As mentioned earlier, the army received funding more on a residual basis. Finland only had 30 tanks and 200 aircraft in its arsenal. this was insufficient for defending the extensive border with the Soviet Union. The main achievement was the defensive line, where money and resources were invested, in which the military relied on for the defense of the area closest to the capital. Losing this territory or dismantling the fortifications would have left Finland in an extremely vulnerable position and entirely dependent on the goodwill of the Soviet Union. Not being sure that Stalin's goals were as limited as they appeared, Finns could not take such risks. In the end, there was no unanimous opinion within the government or among the people regarding whether to accept or reject the demands of the Soviet Union. Moreover, for Finland, it was not that easy. The parliament would not have approved the surrender of territories, and the onset of winter seemed to postpone the outbreak of war, giving hope for more favorable conditions in the future. But they were mistaken. On November 30th, 1939, the Red Army, breaking the Non-Aggression Pact, crossed the border with Finland without declaring war and began to implement the bold plan of the Soviet command. According to the plan, immediately 4 Soviet armies, almost 500,000 people, were to invade the country along the entire border, from the Karelian Isthmus to Lapland. For victory, it seemed more than enough. The confidence in their victory was so high that Soviet soldiers were even warned not to accidentally cross the border with Sweden. On the very first day, Soviet bombers began to attack civilian and military targets in Finland, the capital city of Helsinki and 50 other Finnish cities. Attempts by the Finnish government to immediately initiate peace talks failed. It turned out that the Soviet Union no longer recognized the government in Helsinki. Instead, a communist government led by Otto Kuusinen appeared in Moscow, and on December 2nd, this government signed a new agreement with the Soviet Union, conceding the territories demanded by Moscow in the negotiations. In return, the Soviet government agreed to cede half of Eastern Karelia. It was precisely the establishment of a puppet government in Moscow that prompted many to think that the real goals of the Soviet leadership did not end with the required territories, but more on that later. Finland understood that it could not win, so it acted with semi-partisan methods, using small groups without armored vehicles. But nonetheless, it worked. Despite the demonstrative confidence, including in propaganda, in reality, the Soviet army faced fierce resistance from the Finnish army from the very beginning of the war, led by Carl Gustaf Mannerheim. The Soviet command deployed a division on each road leading west to the Finnish border from the northern part of Lake Ladoga. The rapid advance of the Red Army forced the Finns to retreat to the Kola River, where they managed to halt the advance of Soviet units. At the same time, north of Lake Tolvojärvi, Finnish troops were on the brink of catastrophe. The advance of the Red Army at the beginning of the war here was possibly the most serious and dangerous. In just 6 days, they managed to cover 60 kilometers. The successes of the Soviet command opened up the opportunity for them to strike from the north into the rear of the defenders on the Kola line. However, receiving reinforcements from Mannerheim, the Tolvojärvi group managed to push back, and then the Soviet command sent the 75th Division to counterattack. But strangely enough, this only impeded the progress of the Finns. Repelling the attacks, they managed to push back both divisions, inflicting significant losses on them. Victory in the Battle of Tolvojärvi became the first significant achievement of the Finnish command. The 139th Division, due to its losses, was disbanded. Further south, 2 Soviet divisions managed to advance along Lake Ladoga and push Finnish troops back to the village of Kittilä. The initial advance of Soviet units stretched their supply lines, and the fate of the 2 divisions depended only on 2 roads. This placed the Soviet command in an extremely vulnerable position, because the northern 56th Division was stopped at Kola and could not advance further. Finnish troops began to hang over the 2 roads from the north, creating a threat of encirclement, and soon they took advantage of their position. Reinforcing with the 13th Division, Hägglund first split the 18th, and then the 168th Division. But the Soviet units were in no hurry to surrender. The command of the Red Army promptly organized air supply, and the surrounding soldiers continued to hold their defense in the cold, reaching -45 degrees Celsius. Only in February did they attempt to break out of the encirclement, but they were defeated on the road, which even received the name Valley of Death. As a result, out of 15,000 surrounded troops, only 1,237 managed to escape. However, despite the victories, the situation for the Finns was extremely difficult. While they had soldiers more or less available, a major problem was the shortage of equipment and ammunition, as foreign supplies were limited. According to their estimates, they had ammunition, shells, and fuel in warehouses that would only last for a maximum of 2 months, and they couldn't fix this in any way. The situation was somewhat improved only with rifle ammunition, because the Finns had rifles of the same caliber as the Soviet soldiers, so they simply picked up what was left. They looted not only trucks, but even individual fallen soldiers. At the end of December, 2 Soviet divisions in central Finland were supposed to break through to the west and take Oulu, thus dividing Finland in half. Even at the beginning of the war, the Soviet 163rd Division advanced westward and captured the town of Suomussalmi. Not expecting such pressure far from the isthmus, the Finns needed time to send reinforcements led by Hjalmar Silasvuo. Under his command, the Finns quickly blocked the 2 roads leading to the town, essentially surrounding the division. The Soviet command, promptly assessing the situation, sent the 44th Division to help. However, they soon found themselves in an unfavorable position. The entire division, 15,000 people, 40 tanks, and hundreds of trucks, stretched out in a column for 20 kilometers. Despite the inclusion of experienced Ukrainian soldiers who had fought in Poland, they were completely unfamiliar with winter combat in the northern forests. Hemmed in on both sides by dense forest, they couldn't maneuver or organize a proper defense. Sensing the opportunity, Mannerheim sent the 9th Division to Suomussalmi, strengthening the flanks. The Finns squeezed the Soviet troops in the town from both sides and forced them to flee across the frozen lake to the border with the Soviet Union, leaving behind their equipment and supplies. The commander of the 44th Division, realizing the threat looming over them, requested permission from the Soviet leadership to retreat, but was denied. After regrouping their forces, following the clearance of Suomussalmi, the Finns divided into small groups and, cutting off the road to the border, swiftly struck, dividing and surrounding the division in 6 places. They then systematically began to destroy them. The division found itself without supplies of ammunition, fuel, or food. Small Finnish ski patrols constantly attacked, preventing the soldiers from relaxing or resting. Only on January 6th did Vinogradov receive orders to retreat, but it was already too late. Soldiers began to disperse in small groups in different directions towards the border. However, they frequently fell into the hands of Finnish skiers. Only a few managed to escape. The rest perished at the hands of Finnish soldiers or from exposure in the winter forests of Finland. The 44th Division was destroyed. The commander, upon reaching Soviet territory, was arrested and executed in front of the remaining soldiers. The outcome of the Battle of Suomussalmi was the loss of 2 Soviet divisions. Out of more than 29,000 troops, over 22,000 were killed, wounded, or missing. The defeat at Suomussalmi became a symbol of the Winter War. In the north, the Soviet army also faced difficulties, as did the Finnish. In the Petsamo area, a whole army invaded, while the Finnish command had only small forces at its disposal. Due to extreme shortages of reserves, Mannerheim could offer them nothing but courage and bravery. The area was treeless, windy, and relatively flat, making defense difficult. However, the almost constant darkness and the extreme temperatures of the Lapland winter played in favor of the Finns, who conducted guerrilla attacks on Soviet supply lines and patrols. As a result, the Soviet advance was halted by the efforts of the Finns, whose numbers were 5 times smaller. The battles in the Karelian Isthmus proved to be the most intense. Here, the Red Army needed to break through Finnish fortifications head-on, which proved to be a challenging task. Despite numerical superiority, even 1 Finnish division was enough to hold back the Soviet pressure. The secret to success in the east was Lake Suvanto, which covered the flanks, and Soviet commanders understood this as well. Therefore, on December 25th, Soviet units managed to cross the lake at 3 points. However, their success ended there. Within 2 days, Finnish units pushed them back, and the front stalled. Matters in the west progressed slightly differently, though with the same result. By December 16th, Soviet units had reached the defensive line near Suma. The Finns built 41 concrete bunkers in this area, making the defense stronger than anywhere else on the isthmus. However, due to a planning error, a gap in the line 1 kilometer wide formed, which almost led to a catastrophe. On December 19th, during the First Battle of Suma, several Soviet tanks penetrated the Finnish lines but failed to exploit their success. The Finns remained in their trenches, allowing the Soviet tanks to move freely. The stranded tanks, cut off from supplies, attacked the Finnish strongpoints haphazardly until they were eventually destroyed. By December 22nd, the battle ended in victory for the Finns. By January 1940, the Soviet offensive had stalled. In a month and a half of war, the Red Army had achieved only limited success. In comparison, during the same period, Germany had already conquered France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, launching a campaign against all of them simultaneously. The 7th Army was halted on the Karelian Isthmus, and the 8th Army bogged down in the swamps and was on the brink of catastrophe. The attempt by the 9th Army to cut off Finland ended in disaster at Suomussalmi. The only success of the Soviet forces during the initial stage was achieved in the far north, where the 14th Army captured the strategically important port of Petsamo. It became clear to the Soviet command that attempts to continue the offensive as it would lead to nothing. As they began to understand what had gone wrong, it became apparent that the Red Army was not prepared for winter warfare. Indeed, quite literally, a winter war. The infantrymen were not prepared for winter forest combat. Vehicles were not camouflaged, and soldiers wore khaki uniforms, greatcoats, and simple leather boots. Such equipment not only did not protect them from nearly 40-degree frost, but also made them easy prey against the backdrop of white snow. And since Soviet troops received almost no skis and were not trained in their use, the Army's mobility on the battlefield was greatly limited to roads, leading to encirclements. But let's delve a bit more into how and why the Finns succeeded in this regard. All those encirclements I mentioned occurred according to a single scenario. Soviet troops entering Finnish territory were primarily confined to roads, which were extremely scarce. The terrain around them, forests and swamps, was utterly impassable for vehicles. Soldiers couldn't traverse the forest without vehicles. Firstly, tens of thousands of soldiers required food and ammunition daily, and delivering a sufficient volume off-road was impossible. Secondly, let's not forget that it was winter, and a pretty cold one at that, down to negative 45 degrees Celsius with meters of snow. For soldiers without skis, proper clothing, and supplies, traversing the forest would have been a fatal decision. But why didn't this affect the Finns? The Finns operated in small groups and on skis. They were prepared for both the cold and warfare without roads. They often used horses and sleds for supply, which could easily move through the forests. All of this played a crucial role in Finnish success. Thus, the thousands of Soviet soldiers simply could not concentrate sufficient force in one place and stretched along the roads. As a result, the Finns created a numerical advantage on a small stretch, blocked the road, and attacked from the flanks. This was the tactic of Moti. However, despite all the mistakes made, it would be wrong to underestimate the Soviet command. Stalin and his generals understood that changes were necessary for victory. Throughout January and early February, there was a reinforcement of troops, replenishment of material reserves, reformation of units and formations. Ski units were created, and soldiers were taught to attack bunkers and fight in the forests. Many of the errors I described were corrected, and much more work was done. So much so that it would take another 20 minutes to describe it all. In addition to military preparations, Stalin and the political leadership revised the goals of the war. Instead of capturing territories throughout Finland, the main focus would be solely on the isthmus. To the troops on other fronts, it was simply necessary to hold the defense, diverting the forces of the Finnish army. For the assault on the Mannerheim line, the Northwestern Front was created, consisting of the 7th and 13th Armies. Almost 460,000 troops were deployed on just one front. On February 11th, the Soviet Army began the final stage of the war. Across the front, Soviet divisions launched their attacks. The previous month of constant shelling and assaults had significantly weakened the Finnish units and depleted ammunition stocks. Unlike in December, this time the Red Army Command focused on artillery. Having identified almost 75% of all bunkers and fortifications during the past month, nearly 12,000 shells were raining down on Finnish positions every day. After 10 days of continuous artillery bombardment, Soviet forces made progress on the western Karelian Isthmus. Mannerheim initiated a counterattack, but the plan that had saved Suma in the past failed. One by one, the defenders' strongholds collapsed under Soviet attacks, and the Finns were forced to retreat. On February 15th, Mannerheim authorized the general withdrawal of the 2nd Corps to the reserve defensive line. An attempt to block the advance of Soviet units was made through a desperate counterattack, involving the newly formed Finnish Armored Battalion. However, the debut was unsuccessful, and all but one of the vehicles were destroyed. Subsequently, the Finns retreated to the 3rd line of defense. At the same time, when it became known that Finland might suffer defeat, public opinion in France and Britain, which already supported Finland, leaned towards military intervention. When rumors of a ceasefire reached the governments of Paris and London, both decided to offer military support. The intervention plan involved sending 100,000 British and 35,000 French soldiers. They were supposed to land in Narvik and pass through Swedish territory. The cooperation was planned to begin on March 20th, and transit rights were officially requested from the governments of Norway and Sweden. However, Germany had warned back in December that any Allied troops on their territory would lead to intervention, so they refused. Despite the promise to send troops, Mannerheim viewed the war pessimistically and ultimately succeeded in initiating negotiations with the Soviet government on the same day that the Red Army began its offensive in Viipuri. By mid-March, the situation of the Finnish army on the isthmus were dire. The troops suffered heavy losses, ammunition was depleted, and the equipment needed repairs. The Finnish government, realizing that the long-awaited Franco-British military expedition would not arrive in time, was forced to accept new Soviet conditions. The president of Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. Now the war was over, and according to this treaty, the Soviet Union got even more than it initially wanted and more that it could capture by force. But if the situation in Finland was so catastrophic, why didn't Stalin press on with the war by installing a communist government in Helsinki? We do not know for sure whether Stalin wanted to fully capture Finland, and it is unlikely that we will ever find out. The creation of a communist puppet government in Moscow raises the most questions. Literally on the same day, the Soviet government recognized their authority over Finland, not the government in Helsinki. And until February, the Soviet Union had no contact with the Finnish government, despite their attempts to start negotiations. This fits well into the framework, and the war was not formally declared. In Soviet propaganda, it was called the Red Army's Finnish Campaign, a liberation campaign in Finland, and a struggle against the White Finns. But if that's the case, why did Stalin agree to peace? There are two significant reasons for this. Both Finnish and Soviet historians agree that if he planned to Sovietize Finland, the first month of the war showed how difficult it would be to accomplish. The Finnish strategy relied not only on defense in the war. Throughout the territory, the Finns made large caches of weapons and trained in guerrilla tactics. This was part of the Matti strategy. Helsinki aimed to deter the desire to annex the country by simply increasing the price that it would have to be paid for it. But the second reason was even more crucial. While Europe was embroiled in the phony war, all the attention of Western countries was focused on the Finnish war. They supplied it with weapons and aircraft. However, when this proved to be insufficient, they seriously considered the possibility of sending their troops. Stalin could not be unaware of this, and for him this was bad news. Engaging in a war against the British Empire and the still undefeated France turned out to be too high a price for him, even for the whole of Finland. Therefore, just when the Allies began planning an expedition, the Soviets changed their policy. They once again recognized the government of Kari and Ryti in Helsinki and began negotiations. Finland also found itself unable to prolong the war until the arrival of the Allies, as there was a risk of further retreat and greater losses. In the end, both countries did not dare to prolong the war, albeit for different reasons. But a completely different question arises. Why didn't Stalin do this in 1944, not even putting the communists in power? Especially since by 1944, the might of the Soviet army was already evident, and the Allies would not have intervened. However, the Soviets limited themselves to obtaining Petsamo and allowing the Communist Party to operate in Finland. The only answer is that they would once again risk encountering a partisan war in Finland. But most likely, the main reason lies elsewhere. Stalin devoted all efforts to the race to Berlin, which was much more important both situationally and strategically. The passage reflects on the profound impact of the Winter War on the course of the 20th century. It highlights how a small country can effectively defend itself against a much more powerful neighbor, and how quickly the Soviet Union learned lessons from just 1 month of warfare, drawing conclusions that, under different circumstances, could have enabled it to fully conquer the country. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your opinions in the comments. And consider supporting the channel on Patreon. This has been Dima. Goodbye.